Socrates is one of the most renowned and well-known figures in history. He was one of the most remarkable thinkers of all time, and his philosophical legacy continues to be researched, studied, and debated all over the world. Despite becoming an extremely well-known figure, Socrates did not found a school, nor did he write anything with his own hand. What we know about his life and philosophy has come down to us through other authors, three of whom are considered the main ones: Plato, Aristophanes, and Xenophon. The first is certainly the best known, as he was Socrates' pupil and also became a very important philosopher, whose philosophical legacy is also of enormous value. These three authors portrayed Socrates in diverse ways. Plato, who lived between 428 and 348 BC, and Xenophon, who lived between 430 and 355 BC, proved to be great admirers of Socrates. The Greek playwright Aristophanes, on the other hand, had a less favorable view of the Athenian philosopher. Aristophanes deals with Socrates in a comedy from 423 BC, entitled The Clouds, where the Greek thinker is ridiculed and considered a false sage, as well as being seen as a corrupter of youth and disrespectful to the gods in his philosophy. Aristophanes also presents Socrates as a sophist, but we should not forget that this playwright wrote some of the most famous comedies of ancient times, hence the caricatured style he used to portray the philosopher. Although we don't know his exact intentions, Aristophanes' writings are especially important for learning about the life of the great Greek philosopher. Despite Socrates being negatively characterized by Aristophanes, he wrote things that are remarkably similar to those of Xenophon and Plato. For example, he mentions dialectics as a communicative tool used by Socrates. He also mentions the well-known Socratic method, through which the philosopher questioned his counterparts. The play The Clouds contains some interesting and significant biographical characteristics of Socrates, who is described as a simple, poor man who walked barefoot and lived in a very modest house. In fact, Socrates' humility was one of the main hallmarks of his life, also cited in other sources. In The Memorable Thoughts of Socrates, Xenophon wrote that he has no slaves, his food and drink are not exquisite, his clothing is only a coarse cloak in summer and winter, and he has no shoes or tunic. In addition to these three authors, other particularly important ones have mentioned Socrates, such as Diogenes Laertius or Cicero, as well as Aristotle, another brilliant Greek philosopher. By combining the descriptions of these writers and researchers, it has been possible to construct the trajectory of Socrates' life and philosophy. Socrates was born in Athens in 469 BC. His father was the sculptor Sophroniscus. His mother was the midwife Phaenarete. Some paintings, frescoes, and sculptures help us to better understand what the philosopher looked like physically, and it seems he was not particularly beautiful. But this detail is insignificant when compared to the mastery of his thought and the greatness of his philosophical legacy. He was attractive enough for Xanthippe, whom he married and had a son called Lamprocles. According to some sources, he had 2 children with another wife. He was averse to luxury, dressing simply and shabbily, leading a modest life without attaching importance to material possessions. These traits became his trademark. At times, his behavior was odd, attracting the attention of some of his contemporaries. On some occasions, he would stand still and meditate, remaining in this state for a long time. It was as if the philosopher noticed and felt nothing else around him, contemplating only his thoughts. In the dialogue of the Symposium, Plato recounted some of these traits of the philosopher. For example, he wrote that Socrates was resilient to low temperatures, and on some occasions, while others were protecting themselves from frost, the philosopher could face them outdoors, wearing only a blanket. What's more, he walked barefoot on the ice and didn't seem to feel cold underfoot. Once, in Potidæa, in 432 BC, he reportedly spent 24 hours paralyzed, looking at the horizon and reflecting on some idea, something that impressed the soldiers camped with the philosopher there. Also in the Symposium, Plato tells us that the master drank alcohol like no other man, and yet was never seen drunk. For a period of his life, Socrates tried to follow the same career path as his father, but was unsuccessful as a sculptor. During his youth, he served in the military and took part in the Peloponnesian War, a conflict between the cities of Athens and Sparta that began in 431 and ended in 404 BC. He received a great deal of recognition for his heroism, but as we know today, his destiny was different: philosophy. One of the great landmarks of Socratic philosophy is the exceedingly popular phrase, "I know that I know nothing." In a Platonic dialogue, Socrates recounted the origin of this famous quote. On one occasion, Chaerephon, a childhood friend of his, consulted the Oracle of Delphi, a place considered sacred to the Greeks, where people consulted their destinies with the Pythonesses, who were prophetesses entering an altered state of consciousness. And through the god Apollo, to whom the place was dedicated, they answered those who sought them out. When Chaerephon went to this place, he asked if there was a wiser man in the world than Socrates. The answer was negative. Socrates was the wisest of them all. When Chaerephon told his friend about this, the philosopher was extremely puzzled, as he was fully aware that he knew nothing. According to Plato, he asked himself, "What does the god mean? And what hidden meaning does the answer have? I am not aware of being wise or unwise. What does he mean by declaring me the wisest?" Curious and keen to unravel the oracle's words, he decided to seek out an acquaintance of his who was a politician, and whom he considered to be wise. After talking to him, the Athenian philosopher realized that the politician was not so wise, because he did not recognize the limits of his own ignorance. Socrates concluded, "I am wiser than this man. It is probable that neither of us knows anything important, but he believes he knows something and he does not. I, if I do not know it, do not suppose I know either." Socrates later consulted other politicians, as well as talking to poets and craftsmen who were considered wise. But contact with these people led him to the same conclusion he had reached with the first man he had talked to, that they knew nothing, although they thought the opposite. Socrates became well known in Athens, and one of the main reasons for this was the Socratic method, which consisted of an inquiry process through which the philosopher approached certain individuals, rich or poor, young or old, in places such as gymnasiums, public squares, and banquets, questioning them on subjects that were often apparently simple and straightforward for the interlocutors, but which soon became uncertain. When the people he approached answered a question, Socrates deconstructed these answers with new questions, pointing out mistakes and inconsistencies. Often the interlocutors would learn that they did not know what they initially believed they understood. Amid so many unanswered questions, this self-reflection allowed people to learn more about the issues and take a new perspective on the subject discussed with Socrates. The philosopher wisely used dialectics, which is the art of discourse, as a linguistic tool in the search for truth. Often, this helped people to realize that some concepts accepted a priori as true, after being examined critically and deeply, were false, and these would finally recognize their ignorance. Socrates compared this method to the profession of midwife, which, as we said at the beginning of the video, was that of his mother. He understood that this philosophical approach helped to foster innovative ideas, since these already existed within people and he only helped to give birth to them, as if he were a kind of obstetrician. This labor performed by the thinker, initially questioning his fellow citizens and showing contradictions and misunderstandings in their reasoning, then making them change their perspectives on what they thought they knew, was called maieutic. It's important to stress that, as Xenophon says, Socrates never received any payment for his teaching, unlike the sophists. Another interesting point in his philosophy is the question of virtue, the most valuable of all goods. Socrates believed that the man who possessed knowledge was both virtuous and incapable of evil, since evil was brought about by the ignorant who did not know what was good. For this reason, there was a relationship between morality and knowledge. In other words, if we know what good is, there is no reason to do evil. At 60, Socrates was accused and condemned in Athens. In Apology, Plato recounted the master's allegations before the three accusers, Anytus, Meletus, and Lycaon, as well as other people present during the conviction. According to Plato, Socrates was accused of corrupting youth and not believing in the gods that the people believe in, but in new deities. Xenophon, who also described the process of Socrates' sentencing and death, emphasizes how the Athenian philosopher felt wronged. Xenophon and Plato mention Socrates' admirable peace before death. During the trial, Socrates told those present that he had a divine mission, which began in childhood when he used to hear a voice inside him. This voice would be that of his demon. Historically, the word demon has been given multiple meanings. In Socrates' case, it was a kind of genius or personal guide who spoke to the philosopher and gave him suggestions on what to do. Socrates was eventually sentenced to death and forced to ingest hemlock, a strong poison. In Phaedo, Plato underlines the master's admirable and inspiring composure and courage when faced with death. The man appeared to me to be happy in his manner and speech. He faced death with fearlessness and nobility. And, at the end of this work, he described Socrates as the best, wisest, and most just of men. Socrates was one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Most writers who quote him consider him extremely wise. His philosophical legacy is hugely significant and has influenced other subsequent thinkers. Socrates, among other things, teaches us to better analyze our thoughts and to have a more critical perspective on the surrounding reality. Through the study, we realized how important it is to always maintain a critical stance towards the world, and how important humility is in our quest for knowledge. Plato was an illustrious Greek philosopher whose writings, which have survived to this day, have rendered his ideas immortal. Plato was born in Athens around 427 or 428 BC and came from a noble family. His father was Ariston and his mother was Perictione. The philosopher had two brothers, Adamanthus and Glaucon, and a sister called Potone. His father died when the thinker was still young, and after his death, Perictione remarried, and from this union Antiphon was born. Few people know that Plato was a nickname. The famous philosopher's name was Aristocles, the same as his grandfather. Plato comes from the Greek Platon and means great or broad. This nickname was given to him by his wrestling coach because of his physical size. Plato lived during a politically turbulent period in Athens when the Peloponnesian War took place, a conflict between Athens and Sparta. He also witnessed the period when Athens was defeated by Sicily and witnessed an important political change, when democracy lost ground to oligarchy. This hectic time was certainly an influence on his musings on ethics and politics. Plato received a good education in his childhood and youth. He studied a variety of subjects such as music, history, geometry, and arithmetic, among others. Throughout his youth, he excelled athletically. In his early philosophical studies, through contact with the contemporary Cratylus, he gained an interest in the pre-Socratic Heraclitus of Ephesus, and later also studied the philosophers of the Eleatic school, including Parmenides, who was of particular interest to Plato. At around 20 years old, Plato became a pupil of the remarkable philosopher Socrates. The master had a peculiar demeanor to his contemporaries, dressing shabbily and frequenting public places, where he questioned the most diverse individuals. Plato became Socrates' pupil, and although his master wrote nothing down, his faithful apprentice noted much information about him. Today, a great deal of what we know about Socrates' life and work comes from the works of his pupil Plato. Plato was interested in pursuing a political career, but when his master Socrates was sentenced and executed, he became deeply disillusioned with the local government and began to chart another course for his life. After Socrates' death, Plato left his hometown and moved to Megara, a city west of Athens. In 388 BC, when he was about 40 years old, he spent a period in Italy, where he tried to establish contact with the Pythagoreans, followers of the philosophy founded by the pre-Socratic Pythagoras of Samos. Around the same time, he also went to Cyrene, now Libya, and to Egypt, a particularly important country, where Plato came into contact with and gained knowledge from local sorcerers and prophets. But the documents about the philosopher's visit to these two places are uncertain. On one occasion, while in Italy, Plato met the tyrant Dionysius I, who invited the philosopher to visit Syracuse in Sicily, hoping that the Athenian thinker would become his personal advisor. Plato hoped to present his thoughts and influence the ruler with his political philosophy. But the relationship between the two quickly became troubled, with uncomfortable disagreements between them. Dionysius I became so angry with the Greek thinker that he sold him as a slave to a Spartan from Aegina, an island near Athens. But Plato escaped with the help of Arete of Cyrene and returned to Athens. During this troubled time in Italy, Plato became friends with the Greek philosopher Dion, a relative of Dionysius I. Plato's return from this first trip to Sicily was important. At around 40 years old, he founded the philosophical school called the Academy near Athens. The name Academy comes from Academos, an important Athenian hero. The place was associated with the Muses, entities bound to the god Apollo, one of the main and most worshipped deities in ancient Greece. Plato is said to have charged nothing to those who frequented the place. Another interesting fact is that at least 2 women are believed to have taken part in the meetings of this philosophical school. In his written documents, Plato explored different areas of philosophical research, such as epistemology, politics, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. Among the many aspects of his philosophy, the most important and well-known are the theory of forms and the myth of the cave. The theory of forms is one of the cornerstones of Platonic philosophy. This topic not only appears in one book, but in several of his texts. Plato considers there to be 2 realms, where the plane he calls the spiritual realm is characterized by being immutable, eternal, and stable. But the physical realm, the one we apprehend through our senses, is defined by how mutable things are. This is the world of appearances, of imperfect copies of what exists in the spiritual realm, where essences, truths in themselves, are to be found. In other words, in the spiritual realm, things are absolute. But on the second plane, in the physical realm, they only exist in appearance because their primary roots are in the spiritual realm. That which exists in the sensory sphere is a copy of that which pertains to the spiritual realm. The true cause of things in the physical realm is suprasensible. In other words, everything that exists in the world in which we live is a shadow of what occurs in the spiritual realm. To illustrate this thought, Plato wrote the famous myth or allegory of the cave. We may imagine a cave with several prisoners who, since birth, have been chained there, facing only in one direction, seeing shadows cast by objects behind them, lit by a bonfire. These prisoners believe that the shadows are reality. When a prisoner frees himself and leaves the cave, he is initially dazzled by the sunlight and true reality, but he understands and accepts this new perspective. He learns that the shadows he saw before were not things in themselves. The man returns to the cave to share what he has discovered, but the other prisoners ridicule him and refuse to believe his words. They remain inside, deluded, believing that the shadows were the truth itself, without knowing that the things themselves were not in that place. In this metaphor, the physical realm is the cave, and the spiritual realm, that is reality itself, the source of everything related to the physical sphere, lies outside the cave. This allegory may also be interpreted in unusual ways, and is even associated with other aspects of Platonic philosophy, such as gnoseology, ethics, and politics. Although important, the theory of forms and the myth of the cave are only part of Plato's extensive and complex work, which covers studies on aesthetics, morality, reflections on love, and other subjects. In 367 BC, Plato returned to Sicily. He tried to develop contacts with Dionysius II, who had succeeded his father. This was because the tyrant Dionysius II had developed a taste for philosophy and wanted to study with him. But, as had happened years before, Plato's time in Sicily was frustrating, and the meeting with the stubborn Dionysius II was not fruitful, and disagreements arose between the two. But that wasn't the end of Plato's time in Sicily. In 361 BC, the Greek thinker returned to the city, now accompanied by his students Xenocrates and Speusippus. There were further disagreements, and the philosopher almost died trying to deal with the authoritarian Dionysius II, whose barbaric behavior remained unaltered. His friend Dion eventually won power, but was assassinated in 353 BC. In 360 BC, Plato returned to Athens, where he remained busy until his death. Plato died in approximately 347 BC, aged around 80, and was supposedly buried in or near the grounds of his philosophical school. Plato's academy was destroyed in 86 BC by Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a Roman officer who conquered the Greek city that year. Not only was the academy destroyed, but other parts of the city as well, such as the Lyceum, the philosophical school founded by Aristotle. Even after the academy was destroyed, the Platonic school continued to be taught, until it was closed down in 529 AD by order of the Roman Emperor Justinian. In the 20th century, the location of the academy was found and is now an archaeological site that can be visited free of charge by tourists. Plato's vast philosophical legacy influenced other renowned names in the history of philosophy. Aristotle was one of the academy's students for almost 20 years and was hugely influenced by his teacher Plato. In 250 AD, the Greek Plotinus launched the Neoplatonic school, where he studied and reinterpreted Plato's philosophy, which then resurfaced. Along with Plotinus, many other thinkers, such as St. Augustine, Porphyry, Bergson, or Arthur Schopenhauer, were influenced by the famous works of Plato, one of humanity's leading geniuses, whose books continue to be translated into multiple languages, drawing readers and researchers from all over the world. Some of his most famous works include The Republic, Symposium, Phaedo, Theaetetus, and Phaedrus. Plato's name is widely recognized even by those unfamiliar with philosophy, and his teachings continue to influence new generations of thinkers. Aristotle is one of the most important names in the history of philosophy. Along with Socrates and Plato, he became one of the leading personalities of all time. His thought has survived the test of time, reaching the present day and displaying all its splendor. His works continue to be studied, debated, and influential. Aristotle, like his predecessors Socrates and Plato, is a major thinker in the history of philosophy. However, unlike the other two, he was not an Athenian. He was born around 384 BC in Stygira in Thrace, now a city in the Chalcidian region. His father was Nicomachus, a talented and renowned physician who worked for the Macedonian royal family. The famous historian Diogenes Laertius described Aristotle as someone with a whispered speech. His legs were very thin and his eyes small, but he dressed extravagantly and combed his hair carefully. Aristotle grew up in a privileged financial situation. During his childhood and youth, the philosopher from Stygira received a good education, and when he was between 16 and 17 years old, he was sent to Athens to study at the academy with Plato, who was already around 70 years old. He stayed there and studied for almost 20 years, leaving the city only after his master's death. Following Plato's passing, the academy was inherited by his nephew Speusippus, who placed great emphasis on the teaching of mathematics, much to Aristotle's chagrin. Aristotle, despite being Plato's disciple, developed a philosophical thought that differed in many ways from that of his master. He was even overly critical of various aspects of Platonic philosophy. These disagreements can be seen in Aristotelian metaphysics, which differed from that of the master of the academy, based on a sensible world and a suprasensible world. Another particularity in Aristotle's special interest and attention to the empirical sciences, something we cannot see in Plato's works. But Aristotle's legacy is distinguished by major inquiries into nature. The philosopher moved to Aternius, a Greek colony in Asia Minor. This time was particularly important in Aristotle's life, as he met Pythias, niece of King Hermias of Aternius, whom he married and had a prosperous relationship with. The philosopher once wrote that, after dying, he would have liked to be buried with his beloved. In 348 BC, he lived for a period in Assos and then in Mytilene, the capital of the island of Lesbos. Aristotle's time there was particularly notable for his intense studies into biology and careful observation of nature. In Lesbos, he eagerly studied marine life, and in Assos, he even opened an academy, where he led research into biology. One of the great landmarks of Aristotle's work is that it pioneered the detailed study and systematic classification of certain species. The philosopher is said to have dissected some animals to study them more thoroughly. He compared and observed life forms in nature in an unprecedented way. His collaborations were so important that today it is difficult, and even unfair, to talk about the history of science without mentioning Aristotle. In 343 BC, Aristotle was called to join the court of King Philip II of Macedon, becoming tutor to the 13-year-old Alexander, the king's son, who would one day become Alexander the Great, one of the most famous figures in history. Plutarch tells us that, at least for a certain period, the young Alexander became attached to the philosopher tutor and had a profound respect for him, viewing him as a true father. Aristotle taught the young heir to the Macedon throne various subjects, and his instructions were extremely important in Alexander's life. The philosopher held this position for 3 years, and then returned to his hometown of Stagira, where he lived from 340 to 335 BC, eventually moving to Athens and lived there until 323 BC. In 335 BC, on the outskirts of Athens, Aristotle founded the philosophical school called Lyceum, named after the word Lykios, because the school was in an area dedicated to Apollo, known as Lykios or Lyceum. Aristotle had many students and debated different areas of knowledge with them. Some notable personalities studied with him, including the philosophers Aristoxenus of Tarentum, Critolus, Strato of Lampsacus, and many others. The Lyceum became known as the Peripatetic School, and its students came to be called Peripatetics. The word peripatetic comes from Greek and can be translated as strolling or walking. The origin lies in the fact that Aristotle's classes took place during garden walks, during which he and his students engaged in philosophical reflections and debates. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. This sparked an anti-Macedonian reaction among the Athenians, and accusations were leveled against Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor. For safety reasons, the philosopher left the city and moved to Chalkis, on the Greek island of Euboea. Aristotle said that he had left Athens to not let philosophy be wronged twice, clearly referring to Socrates' fate, another notable Greek philosopher, whose practice was rejected by some of his contemporaries who accused, condemned, and killed him. The archaeological discovery of the Lyceum is recent, having taken place in 1996. The site was accidentally found in the center of Athens, just behind the Greek Parliament, during excavations to build a modern art museum. Since 2009, the Lyceum has been available to the public. It opens every day and charges a small fee to visitors. When we study this great Greek philosopher, we find a division in his writings, made in antiquity by some scholars who considered that Aristotle produced texts especially to be read by the public, the so-called exoteric writings, and also technical texts, known as esoteric writings, prepared by the philosopher for use in the Lyceum. Unfortunately, almost all of the contents of the first category have been lost over time, although many of his vast productions have come down to us. During the Middle Ages, philosophers once again focused on Aristotelianism during the so-called Islamic philosophy or Arab philosophy. One of the leading figures in Arabic philosophy, who shaped the entire context of medieval philosophy, was Averroes, a notable Muslim philosopher and physician. He was a great scholar of Aristotle's philosophy. His annotations on the Greek thinker's work helped to awaken interest in Aristotelian thought in the Middle Ages. We can also mention Al-Ghazali and Avicenna, outstanding Arab philosophical personalities who were also inspired by Aristotle's studies. Apart from the influence and visibility that Aristotelian philosophy had at that time, his work lived on after this historical period, inspiring great personalities, including two illustrious men, the Polish Nicolaus Copernicus and the Italian Galileo Galilei. The latter disagreed with and challenged Aristotelian physics. Besides these two renowned personalities, Darwin wrote the following words: "Linnaeus and Cuvier have been my two gods, though in very different ways, but they were mere schoolboys to old Aristotle." In his writings, Aristotle addresses multiple areas of study, such as metaphysics, ethics, politics, logic, zoology, mathematics, art, among others. In general, through his documents and their vast thematic scope, the philosopher ended up contributing to many areas of knowledge beyond philosophy. In 2016, during the 2,400 Years of Aristotle World Congress, a group of Greek archaeologists claimed to have found Aristotle's tomb in Stagira, the place where the thinker was born. Although without any definitive proof, the evidence was strong and the team seemed confident of their discovery. The site where the archaeologists said they had found the tomb contains descriptions similar to the information found in some official documents that mention the death and burial of Aristotle's ashes. The evidence found in the excavations is powerful proof that this was the thinker's tomb. But it is not yet certain whether this was the illustrious philosopher's final resting place or not. Aristotle was one of the world's most famous thinkers, and his philosophical legacy still fascinates and attracts the attention of many. He remains a highly respected personality whose work is of enormous significance to the history of philosophy.
One of humanity's most brilliant figures, Giordano Bruno was a leading member of the Renaissance, a period of artistic, cultural, and ideological change in Europe, during which other major figures stood out, such as Machiavelli and Thomas More in philosophy, Leonardo da Vinci in painting, Dante Alighieri in literature, among other well-known geniuses. By and large, Giordano Bruno's religious beliefs and philosophical system were at odds with what was accepted in Europe at the time he lived. This led to severe tensions with the church and a tragic end to his life, since his work and thinking broke with all the prevailing certainties of his time. Filippo Bruno was born in 1545 in Nola, in the Italian province of Naples. His father was Giovanni Bruno, and his mother was Frau Lisa Savellina. When he was 15, the young Bruno joined the convent of San Domenico in Naples, at which point he came to be called Giordano. The young Italian spent a decade in the convent and left in 1575. While living under such a Christian regime, Bruno met authors and themes that strayed quite far from the Catholic precepts, such as Lullius and Copernicus. The latter presented a new approach to thinking, which sought to reconcile reason and faith, while Copernicus was an advocate of heliocentrism, i.e., he believed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, differently from the prevailing and accepted notion at the time, which said that it was the Sun that rotated around the Earth, with it being the center of the universe. Having contacted these writers and many other ideas, as well as his interest in the Jewish Kabbalah and the work of Nicholas of Cusa, besides showing evidence that he had a different religious vision to that of Catholicism, Bruno soon began to be criticized, scrutinized, and berated by members of the convent. In general, he was always extremely critical of all the theological dogmas of his time. This rebellious nature, which manifested itself during this period, followed him throughout his life. Giordano was soon accused of heresy in 1576 and had to flee to Rome when he was still 28. Giordano Bruno moved on to other cities in his native country, including Turin, Genoa, Noli, and others. During the following 14 years, the well-known Italian thinker wandered around different European countries, such as France, England, Switzerland, and Germany. During this enriching experience of visiting various places on the European continent, Giordano Bruno taught astronomy and Latin. During his life, Giordano Bruno had problems not only with Catholic dogma. In 1579, when he was in the Italian commune of Genoa, he came close to the Calvinist church, but was soon excommunicated because he disagreed with some of its precepts. He was later also excommunicated by the Lutheran Church, to which he had converted during a period when he spent in Germany. He was expelled from the Lutheran Church after about a year. Just as had also happened in relation to Catholicism, his ideas were fundamentally different to what these two other religious doctrines had to offer. Giordano Bruno's philosophy was based on the idea that the universe was endless and unlimited. The famous Italian thinker also believed that there were many other planets like Earth, and that they too had intelligent life, just as our own world does. In his opinion, God was infinite, so his creation should also be infinite, since the effect, i.e. creation, would reflect the cause, i.e. God. Giordano considered God to be present in all things. He believed that matter was the bearer of a divine principle, meaning that everything had a soul. Nature was essentially divine, and so God was in everything. The human body, plants, minerals, stones, and animals all bore a soul. Bruno also advocated heliocentrism and strongly opposed Aristotelian philosophy, refuting the Greek philosophers' views on the cosmos and nature. Giordano Bruno not only had a different cosmological perspective to most of his contemporaries, but he also acquired a remarkable degree of knowledge about magic and religion and related subjects. This is why he is sometimes labeled as an occultist. His fascination with magic was a constant theme in his writings. While living in Frankfurt, Germany, he dictated the work Treatise on Magic to a disciple. This book deals with a range of topics, such as the different meanings of the word magic and their uses over time, as well as reflecting on subjects such as magicians, faith, imagination, spirits, and demons. Bruno also knew about Hermeticism, a complex and profound ancient wisdom that is still one of the most important subjects in magic studies today. The so-called art of memory is surely one of the most interesting aspects of the Italian thinker's life. From what we know, one of the reasons Bruno became so famous was his extraordinary memory. It is said that he could memorize short passages, pages, or even entire books. The art of memory is also known as mnemotechnics, a subject addressed in some of Giordano Bruno's literary works, as he knew the precise techniques to memorize so many things. To do this, he basically used a range of symbolic illustrations that had certain specific meanings, and made use of the imagination as a powerful and effective tool with which to engrave in the mind what he wanted to absorb. Historically, nevertheless, this sort of memorization technique and practice didn't start with Bruno, but already existed and was used before him. But he stood out due to his knowledge of the subject and his astounding memorizing talent. Bruno went as far as to teach the art of memory to several people, including King Henry III. One of Bruno's works on the art of memory, called De Umbris Adirum, was dedicated to Henry. During his wanderings in 1590, the thinker moved to Frankfurt, Germany. During his stay, he was contacted by a nobleman from Venice called Giovanni Mocenigo, who was keen to learn about Giordano Bruno's expertise in the art of memory. The philosopher agreed to leave with Mocenigo, who would give him shelter and protection in exchange for knowledge. On May 22, 1592, Mocenigo locked the philosopher in a room in his house and sent for the Holy Office, to whom he promptly handed over Giordano Bruno and some of his writings that had not yet been published. The church had already been eager to arrest him for his subversive works. Mocenigo double-crossed Bruno, and, from that moment on, the Nola thinker's life turned tragic. Giordano Bruno's trial began on July 3, 1592, in Venice. In the following year, the trial continued in Rome. The philosopher was kept captive for the long years of his trial until, finally, on January 20, 1600, on the orders of Pope Clement VIII, the congregation ruled that Giordano Bruno's books were to be added to the Index of Forbidden Books, and the Italian thinker was sentenced to death. The story goes that, when he heard what his fate would be, he stared at the judges and boldly said that, when they passed sentence, they were more afraid than he was when he heard it. Bruno, during his imprisonment and trial, displayed tremendous fortitude and stood firm in defense of his beliefs. The Italian philosopher was taken to the Campo dei Fiori on February 17, 1600. He was strung up naked on a stake, a wooden object shoved into his mouth to stop him from speaking too provocatively, and burned alive. This ultimate act of cruelty, preventing him from speaking, turned Giordano Bruno into a symbol for those who stand up for free thought and freedom of expression. He influenced the great personalities who followed him, such as Galileo Galilei and the philosopher Leibniz. His works are constantly studied, read, and researched to this day. Giordano Bruno's life was adapted into a movie in 1973. His extensive oeuvre includes important books such as Cause, Principle, and Unity, On Infinity, the Universe and the Worlds, and The Heroic Frenzies. His works show how cutting-edge his ideas were for the era he lived in. Giordano Bruno was one of the most heterodox philosophers in the history of Western thought, and surely one of the most daring and brave. Galileo Galilei was one of history's most remarkable and well-known personalities. Physicist, mathematician, and astronomer, his methodologies, findings, and works made him one of the most important names in science of all time. He was born on February 15, 1564, in Pisa, Italy. He was the son of musician Vincent Bonaiut Galilei and Julia. The couple had 7 children, but only 4 survived. While Galileo Galilei's family was not affluent, they did their best to provide him with a good education from an early age. He started to display his genius at an incredibly early age, as he was a creative child with original ideas. Since his father was a musician, he had the chance to explore art and painting, something in which he was remarkably skilled. But his father, Vincent, was aware of the difficulties of an artistic career, preferred to urge his son to take a different path. In 1581, Galileo started to study medicine at the University of Pisa. During his early days there, Galileo learned about the works of famous mathematicians such as Archimedes and Euclid, with whom he had soon become closely familiar. Throughout his university experience, Galileo started to argue against the mainstream views. This behavior angered his professors, prompting one of his teachers to warn his father about the student's brashness. While attending medical school, Galileo also took private math lessons with Ostilio Ricci, becoming increasingly acquainted with numbers. His career in medicine obviously did not last long, and after 4 years, Galileo ended up changing his field of study and started studying mathematics despite his father's objections. To earn a living, he started giving private lessons in Florence. When he traveled to the Italian capital in 1587, he gained recognition for his knack for numbers and his broad scientific knowledge. Galileo began teaching at the University of Pisa in 1589. In his new role as a teacher, Galileo kept a high profile as a disprover of the prevailing ideas of his time. His insights into the world, science, and nature often made people around him simply stunned. He questioned and even criticized the use of the robe, traditionally worn in university circles. While working as a professor, Galileo was said to have performed an experiment to study gravity by throwing 2 objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to prove how the force of the Earth attracted all bodies equally. Galileo started teaching at the University of Padua in 1592, where his ideas gained more acceptance. He started to enjoy the admiration and recognition of professors and students alike. The Italian mathematician had a relationship with a Venetian woman called Marina Gamba, and they had 3 children called Virginia and Vincenzo, yet they never married. The Italian mathematician heard about the extraordinary invention of the telescope in the Netherlands in 1609 and was thrilled to learn about it, seeing how useful it would be for science. While he had never seen or handled one, Galileo was delighted by this invention and built a similar device with refinements and a greater range than the original model. Galileo's fine-tuned telescope amazed his contemporaries. Galileo constantly used this instrument to make important astronomical observations, leading him to make remarkable findings and discoveries, later referred to in his book, The Celestial Messenger. It was written in Latin and was widely sold in a fleeting period. Galileo wrote about stars that had never been seen before. After several observations, Galileo also found out about the satellites of the planet Jupiter. A surprising discovery by Galileo Galilei was that the moon was irregularly shaped. In other words, its surface was not as smooth as was believed at the time. Through his observations, the remarkable Italian developed an astronomical perspective that was fundamentally unique and different from that of most of his contemporaries. Apart from improving the telescope, as an inventor, he also perfected the lunette, and in 1597, Galileo Galilei devised the geometric compass, an invention that earned him some money. The tireless Italian mathematician was constantly conducting research and documenting his theses in his workshop, using a range of scientific apparatuses to help him in his research. Galileo pursued a research method that was essentially different from the Aristotelian and theological legacy of the time. His stance against Aristotle's philosophy was set out in some of his books, such as Discourses on Bodies and Water and History and Demonstration of Sunspots. Alongside this position against the Greek thinker, Galileo shared the ideas of Nicholas Copernicus, a notable Polish astronomer and mathematician who championed the heliocentric theory, which held that the sun was the center of the solar system, in direct opposition to geocentrism, a model which considered that the Earth was motionless at the heart of the universe. By then, heliocentric cosmology provided an opposing view to that held by the Church, and Nicholas Copernicus was declared a heretic. Through his study of the heliocentric theory, Galileo produced his tidal theory, claiming that the tides were proof of the Earth's movement. Curious and committed to understanding the movement of bodies, the Italian ran an experiment in which he made balls roll down a slope. He then concluded that gravitational acceleration acted the same way on objects, regardless of their structure. Only by acting externally could the speed or direction of bodies be altered. Aside from these examples, Galileo's legacy of studies and theories is huge. He wrote several works, such as Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Two New Sciences, Letters on Sunspots, and others. His books and studies were revolutionary for both astronomy and physics. During his lifetime, the Church enjoyed authoritarian power and a powerful social influence in Europe. Galileo's ideas soon began to bother the religious authorities. All his life, the Italian was under constant persecution and had political and religious foes. The Church considered Copernicus' work and ideas to be heretical in 1612. Even so, the following year, Galileo published a book in which he expressed his agreement with Copernicus' ideas. By and large, his outlook on the world, the content of his works, and his experiments increasingly disturbed some people associated with the Church, and this soon began to grow into a dangerous situation for Galileo Galilei. In 1616, he was called to stand officially before the Church and Cardinal Bellarmine. On this occasion, the Holy Office made clear how precarious his condition was. He was then advised to stop defending and speaking his ideas, which were considered heretical. He signed the documents to end this and pledged to drop some of his ideas and thoughts, as the Church advised him to do in a very threatening manner. As time went by, while Galileo continued to write and carry out his research and reading, he took on a more socially low-key stance. Nevertheless, in 1632, he published a book called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican. In it, Galileo once again discussed the Copernican theory, essentially contrary to the dogmas of the Church. In 1633, he was once again asked to report to Rome. His health was fragile at the time, but he was forced to travel to the Italian capital. There, he was put on trial for a 6-month period. During this process, he was interrogated and tried to explain himself, but his arguments were not enough to avoid punishment. On July the 23rd, his book Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican, was banned from circulation and deemed blasphemous. Galileo was also in prison and had to repeat 7 psalms a week for 3 years. He was then sentenced to house arrest. One reason the Church turned against Galileo was the fact that in some of his writings, he made some critical interpretations and observations about the Bible that were widely different from what the Church advocated to its believers. Galileo Galilei's prolific life ended with a great deal of suffering. In 1634, he was shaken by the death of his daughter, Virginia, who passed away at 34. Despite this loss, he carried on with his work and completed the book The Discourses on Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, which is considered to be one of his most important publications. He relied on the help of his disciples Vincenzo Viviani and Evangelista Torricelli, who were well with him in his old age and helped him at the end of his life. As a result of his frequent use of his telescope for astronomical observations, including sunspots, Galileo lost his sight, something he greatly suffered from. Galileo died on January 8, 1642, in Florence. The body of the renowned Italian remains to this day in the Church of Santa Croce in the same Italian city. Following Galileo's death, some people close to him wanted to build a monument in his honor. The Church, however, through Pope Urban VIII, quickly opposed this idea and stopped it from happening, claiming that Galileo was a harmful social influence. Finally, in 1992, the Church, through Pope John Paul II, recognized its error in condemning Galileo, apologizing for the mistakes, attacks, and violent acts that were committed against him by the Catholic Church over time. Galileo was a visionary thinker whose breakthroughs altered the course of science. He passionately believed in the universe's mathematical language and prized observation and experimentation as key processes in the scientific method. Leonardo da Vinci was one of humanity's greatest geniuses. Endowed with unparalleled intelligence, he became known worldwide for his paintings Mona Lisa and The Last Supper. But he also excelled in other areas of knowledge, such as engineering, botany, anatomy, mathematics, literature, geology, among others. Considered to be a man way ahead of his time, Leonardo da Vinci conceived impressive projects that foresaw flying machines, sewage systems, battle tanks, parachutes, diving dresses, among many others. The probable date of his birth is April 15, 1452, in Italy, in a town near Florence called Villa da Vinci, from where his surname came. The son of Piero da Vinci and the young peasant Caterina Lippi was lucky that his parents weren't married. If they had been, he would have probably followed his father's footsteps for the sake of tradition, working as a notary public. We know little about his childhood. He received no formal education, only attending an abacus school where he was taught mathematical skills useful in the commercial field. His father quickly spotted Leonardo's talent and sent him as an apprentice to the famous painter Andrea del Verrocchio, who lived in Florence. In this master's studio, the young Leonardo perfected more and more techniques and studies. At the time, he was 14 years old and considered an extremely handsome boy. It is said that he was Verrocchio's model for sculpting an impressive bronze statue of David. In 1472, Leonardo joined the Florence Painters Guild as a master, but continued his career in Verrocchio's studio, probably as an assistant. While still a disciple, Leonardo collaborated with the master on the painting The Baptism of Christ. His talent was so striking that Verrocchio, it is said, when he saw himself being surpassed by his apprentice, decided to stop painting. At the end of the 1470s, Leonardo began painting the Admiration of the Magi, commissioned by the monks of the Church of Santo Donato in Scopetto, Florence, but did not finish the work. This was often the case, as Leonardo's restless mind was constantly searching for a new technique or discovery. As soon as he reached his goal or satisfied his curiosity, he lost interest. For this reason, Florentines were hesitant to commission a work from the artist because of fears that it would not be finished. In 1482, Leonardo da Vinci went to Milan, the cultural center of the time. He was sent by Lorenzo the Magnificent, a member of the Medici and governor of Florence. Leonardo was joined by Andrea Salai, his young apprentice, of whom he made countless drawings throughout his life. In Milan, he worked for Ludovico Sforza, the city's duke. First, he worked as a show producer. It was there that he painted The Last Supper, one of his best-known and most admired works. Over time, Leonardo became a renowned artist, despite being known for delays in completing his works, or even never finishing them at all. This was echoed in Milan, although the work remained unfinished due to fate and not Leonardo's fault. Ludovico Sforza commissioned the artist to create a gigantic bronze monument of a horse, some 8 meters high. Leonardo, who loved anatomy, and to satisfy Ludovico's request, researched the anatomy of horses in detail, even dissecting them. The results of these studies were recorded in his notebook. But as it happened, on other occasions, he ended up refocusing his attention on other projects. In 1493, he displayed a clay version of the Great Equestrian Monument, which earned him widespread praise. While Leonardo was planning an efficient way of casting bronze from the mold, something sudden happened. Milan was taken by the French, and the bronze that had been saved for the horse sculpture was used to make cannons. Unfortunately, it was impossible to stop the French troops, who conquered Milan in 1499. Leonardo, still with Salai, went to Venice and returned to Florence in 1500. In 1503, he produced Mona Lisa, his most popular work, also known as La Gioconda. In 1506, he returned to Milan with Salai. The boy Francesco Melzi was taken in by Leonardo as a pupil because of the great friendship he had with the boy's father. Leonardo stayed in Milan until 1513 and then went to Rome. Now extremely well known, his name reached French monarch Francis I, who invited him to live in the country. In 1516, Leonardo da Vinci moved into a residence near Amboise, receiving the title of painter, architect, and royal mechanic. In 1519, weakened by illness and with a paralyzed hand because of health problems, he wrote his will. His heirs included Melzi and Salai, who were entitled to the artist's manuscripts and artistic and scientific works. Leonardo died on May 2, 1519. He was 67 years old. He was buried in the church of Château d'Amboise, which was demolished at the beginning of the 19th century. Many years later, Leonardo da Vinci's possible remains were found on the site and taken to the chapel of St. Hubert outside the Château d'Amboise. Leonardo da Vinci was endowed with enormous physical beauty, strong, muscular, with blonde curly hair. He was elegant and charismatic. He was a kind and generous man, with many friends. Because he loved animals and nature, he was a vegetarian. And two other brilliant characteristics made him stand out from the rest. He was extremely observant and curious. For him, it was necessary to take a step-by-step look at everything around him without missing a single detail. These characteristics helped him to become an outstanding artist in perfectly capturing a specific moment, transferring it to the canvas with talented brushstrokes. He was attracted to men and regarded this with ease and serenity. There is some controversy about Leonardo's homosexuality. According to historical records, Leonardo da Vinci was accused in 1476 of having sexual relations with the handsome young Jacopo Saltarelli, a prostitute who was only 17. But there wasn't enough evidence, and he was eventually acquitted of the charge, which at the time could have been punishable by death. A new accusation soon arose, but it too fell for lack of evidence. Although we didn't know for sure about his sexuality, that didn't stop the painter from depicting female figures with great sensitivity, capturing their souls. He didn't mind attracting attention. When he was around 50 and living in Florence, he spent huge sums on clothes and books. He used to dress unusually and eccentrically, often in pink robe that reached his knees. As for books, of which there are many at the time, he had works on anatomy, medicine, mathematics, and editions of Aesop's fables. In fact, Leonardo himself wrote fables. His works included everything he observed and learned. Because he was a great anatomist, he even dissected cadavers, portraying the human body in a perfect and harmonious way. Leonardo wrote down everything he observed and imagined. He was always ready for another draft, and, in all, about 7,000 pages of writings and sketches remained. He didn't add dates to his notebooks and would make several notes on a single page. He would even go back and use pages written long ago. Any blank space was useful for a new log. Thanks to these notes, we now know more about his genius. Leonardo used what is known as mirror writing, i.e., from right to left. This was probably because he was left-handed and avoided smudging. Upon the death of Melzi, who had inherited some of his notebooks, these records were gradually lost, scattered in separate places. Later, the sculptor Pompeo Leone gathered what he could and divided Leonardo's notebooks into themes: engineering, anatomy, etc. Over the years, they passed from hand to hand until Bill Gates bought them. Leonardo da Vinci became known worldwide mainly for his paintings. Let's look at a few of them. The Last Supper was produced between 1495 and 1498. The work is about 4.5 meters high and approximately 9 meters wide. It was a fresco commissioned by Ludovico Sforza to decorate the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The scene shows us the exact moment when Jesus, gathered with his disciples for a last meal, announces that he will be betrayed by one of them. While Christ's face remains serene, the gestures and movements reveal the outrage and intense agitation of the disciples, divided into groups of 3. Unfortunately, this magnificent work suffered rapid deterioration due to the technique chosen by Leonardo. Over the years, it underwent several restorations to prevent it from disappearing. In 1652, the local monks opened a door below the fresco and, breaking through the wall, cut off the lower part of the table, showing Jesus' feet, destroying a section of the work. The Last Supper is a testament to Leonardo's artistic talent and sensitivity. Now let's talk about the Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda, a painting begun in 1503. Unlike the grandeur of the Last Supper, Mona Lisa is a small work, measuring 77 by 53 centimeters. Although many believe in the mystery surrounding the figure depicted, some claiming that the image may even represent Leonardo da Vinci, the woman in this painting was probably Lisa del Giocondo. Lisa was the young wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a silk merchant from Florence. Francesco commissioned a portrait of his wife when she was around 24 years old. The work, also known as La Gioconda, features the girl's smile and eyes. The smile, although discreet, seems to express happiness and satisfaction. It is said that when Leonardo was making this portrait, he had people around him who were making jokes, which brought a smile to Lisa's face. Another interesting point is the eyes. Even if the viewer moves sideways, they have the distinct impression that Mona Lisa's piercing eyes are following them. Although it was begun in 1503, when Leonardo moved to Milan, he took the painting with him. He kept adding brushstrokes until 1517. The painting remained with the Da Vinci family for years and passed through several owners until it entered the Louvre Museum's collection. A curious event occurred in 1911 when the work disappeared, and the theft was only noticed 24 hours later. Despite investigations, the police failed to solve the problem, and the painting remained missing until 1913, when it was found in Florence with Vincenzo Perugia, the culprit and a former employee of the Louvre Museum. The Mona Lisa remains on display at the Louvre today, and is the museum's most visited work, attracting millions of people every year. The Vitruvian Man was made in 1490 and is not necessarily a painting by Leonardo, but one of his best-known drawings, where we see a naked man with perfectly harmonious proportions. His legs and arms are spread out inside a circle and a square. Leonardo da Vinci based his work on that of Marcus Vitruvius Polonius, a Roman architect from the 1st century BC, who wanted to show the human body's perfect proportions. This drawing, in which art and science blend, is entirely in line with the Renaissance, as it places man in a prominent position in the world. The Vitruvian Man is currently in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, Italy. Leonardo da Vinci's list of works and inventions is impressive. He is the author of some of the most famous paintings of all time, a scientist and scholar of nature and anatomy, and a great inventor. With projects including instruments and flying machines, Leonardo da Vinci was a curious man with a unique talent. His ideas were visionary, and it is no coincidence that some regard him as the greatest genius of all time. William Shakespeare is considered one of the most celebrated representatives of the English language of all time. He is known worldwide for the many plays he wrote, including Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, King Lear, Henry V, and Othello, among many others. As well as being a brilliant playwright, Shakespeare was also an actor and poet. He was born in April 1564. The exact date of his birth is uncertain, but it probably occurred on the 23rd in the town of Stratford-upon-Avon. William was the son of merchant John Shakespeare and Mary Arden. He was the couple's eldest son and studied at Stratford Grammar School, where he learned Latin and rhetoric. According to sources, he didn't complete his studies because his father went through an economic crisis, and the boy gave up his studies to help him. At the age of 18, he married the villager Anne Hathaway, 8 years his senior, and already pregnant with the couple's first child. 6 months after their union, their first child, Susanna, was born. In 1585, twins Hamnet and Judith were born. Unfortunately, Hamnet did not reach adulthood and died in 1596. Shakespeare lost his father in 1601 and his mother in 1608. He adored his daughters, for whom he tried to arrange a good marriage. Susanna married in 1607 and Judith in 1616. Although they remained married, Anne Hathaway continued to live in Stratford. Shakespeare spent years living in London, visiting his family whenever possible. From the birth of the twins until 1592, we know almost nothing about the life of the great English author. Many assumptions have emerged, including that Shakespeare fled to London because he had been hunting on someone else's property. This caused him to be pursued by the law and he had to leave Stratford. But it is clear that in 1592 he was in the English capital, where his plays were already being performed. At the time, the monarch was Elizabeth I and England was at its peak. The theater of the time was under the Queen's protection, which was an important asset, and artistic activity in London was booming. Shortly after Shakespeare's debut, the theaters had to remain closed for some time, as England was ravaged by a plague outbreak. The author took advantage of this time to compose poems. He wrote some famous ones such as Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece. During this period, to avoid contracting the plague, the playwright spent some time in the town of Stratford, where the danger of contagion was lower than in London. But it was in the English capital that almost all his works were written. There he became famous and successful as an actor and writer. He owned the Lord Chamberlain's Men Theatre Company, also known as the King's Men, and was one of the proprietors of the Globe Theatre, an English theatre built in 1599 during Elizabeth's reign. In 1613, a terrible fire broke out during a performance, and the venue was destroyed. It was rebuilt sometime later, but eventually closed its doors. It is now open under the name Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. The reconstruction tried to imitate the original layout. About a decade into his career, William Shakespeare began to invest his earnings in buying property, houses, and land. Around 1610, the writer left London, returning to Stratford to live with his family. He spent his days writing and resting, but his home life was a source of concern. His youngest daughter, Judith's husband, had impregnated a local girl who died during childbirth. This embarrassed Shakespeare, who disapproved of his son-in-law's behavior, especially as it was offensive to his beloved daughter. One morning, the playwright woke up feverish. The night before, he had been in a tavern with friends and had perhaps drunk too much. His fever was high, and his condition seemed hopeless. Even with medical care and the affection of his family, Shakespeare died in 1616, on April the 23rd, the same day as the probable date of his birth. He was 52 years old. The exact cause of death is unknown. It could have been a liver crisis, perhaps due to alcohol intake, or a facial bone tumor. According to a more recent theory, based on extensive research, he may have died of an eye tumor, and not because of alcohol abuse. There are also those who say that he was the victim of epidemic typhus. Shakespeare died, but he left us a vast body of work, translated into more than 80 languages. They continue to inspire and delight people all over the world. When we analyze all the historical records, there are theories that question Shakespeare's existence, and especially the authorship of many works attributed to him. Multiple names have been considered to be the true authors of the plays, among them the philosopher Francis Bacon, the playwright Christopher Marlowe, and even Queen Elizabeth I. But there is convincing evidence to prove the existence of the famous William Shakespeare. Documents, signatures, contracts, countless witnesses, including the actors who worked on his plays. There are also controversies about William Shakespeare's sexuality, even though he married and had children. Some people claim that the marriage only took place on the insistence of Anne Hathaway's family because she was pregnant. Still, on the subject of his love life, there are also assumptions about his relationship with another woman when he lived in London, and his involvement with men based on some of the sonnets he wrote. Some seem to describe love for a man, but this may just be a literary device. In William Shakespeare's time, women were not allowed to act in theater. Men always played the female roles. In fact, most of the audience was male. The theaters were always full and performances took place in the afternoon, as people went to bed early, and the streets weren't entirely safe at night. Shakespeare's audience for his works was people of different social levels, education, and ages. He used a language that everyone could understand. In his works, he dealt with social and political issues, death, intrigue, betrayal, love, among other themes of the human condition. He also used the soliloquy, a moment in which the characters talk to themselves so that the audience is privy to their confessions, learning about their desires, fears, joys, etc., and often identifying with them. The audience felt fully immersed in the story. In more than one week, Shakespeare adds a passage to the plot in which a scene is played out. In other words, there is a play within the play. This happens, for example, in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet. Shakespeare produced works in different genres, adapting himself perfectly to the demands of each one. His dramaturgy is divided into comedies, tragedies, and tragicomedies or romances. In some of his works, Shakespeare mixed elements from different genres. In a narrative by him, it was not uncommon to find an intense moment blended with some humor, for example. William Shakespeare also deserves to be recognized for his contribution to the English language, since he created words and expressions that are still used in the language today. Some examples are manager and fashionable. Shakespeare introduced around 2,000 words in the English vocabulary. Some of them are used today with a different meaning. As well as being an excellent playwright, William Shakespeare also proved to be an excellent poet. He composed 2 poems considered erotic, Venus and Adonis from 1593, and The Rape of Lucrece from 1594. He also composed 154 sonnets throughout his life, published in 1609 on love, death, life, and many other themes. In 1623, he published the First Folio, a collection of William Shakespeare's plays. Approximately 240 copies of the First Folio still exist. Shakespeare's works continued to be widely known. Such was the author's genius. Some of them ended up becoming extremely famous. Romeo and Juliet is one of the most staged plays in the world. It tells of the intense love between two teenagers, Juliet Capulet and Romeo Montecchio, and how the enmity between their two families led to the couple's tragic end. More than 70 films have been made with the work as their inspiration. Literary adaptations have also been made over the years. The story is timeless and continues to inspire artists. Hamlet takes a different approach to Romeo and Juliet. It is Shakespeare's longest play, and the narrative is about Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, whose father is murdered. The famous tragedy explores themes such as the quest for revenge, morality, and even the nature of existence and the human condition. As well as its immense artistic and literary value, Shakespeare's output has philosophical complexities that continue to be analyzed and studied, with new visions and interpretations of the works constantly emerging as we better understand their complexity. Shakespeare was a complex author, with important works that entertained and criticized his society. His description of the characters' attitudes in his scenarios displayed a keen understanding of human nature and a rare talent for transforming even our flaws into poetry and art. François-Marie Arouet is not a well-known name, but his nom de plume, Voltaire, became legendary. Using this alias, he established himself as an impeccable writer, an outstanding philosopher, and one of the Enlightenment's leading figures, alongside Rousseau and Montesquieu. Voltaire was a sardonic and controversial figure, with a deeply thoughtful and brilliantly audacious mind. His literary output was creative, wide-ranging, thought-provoking, and highly provocative, which even led to him being exiled, imprisoned, and having some of his manuscripts torched. The celebrated and talented writer Victor Hugo once wrote of him, "To mention Voltaire is to characterize the entire 18th century." François-Marie Arouet, or Voltaire, was born on November 21, 1694 in Paris. He was born into such poor health that a hospital nurse only gave him 1 day to live. Fortunately, she was wrong. Arouet and his older brother, Armand, were from a bourgeois family. Their mother, Marie Marguerite Armand, died when Voltaire was still a child, and their father was François Arouet. At first, Voltaire studied under the Abbé de Chateauneuf at home, and later he was taught by the Jesuits at the Collège Louis le Grand. He later said that all he learned at that stage of his life was Latin and some nonsense. Despite this statement, he was a standout student, notable for his brilliant and witty mind. He chose literature when it came to his career. In his youth, Voltaire, while hardworking in his studies, also enjoyed going out and having fun late at night. Worried by his son's behavior, his father twice sent him away from Paris, first to Caen, and then to The Hague. Even in these new settings, Voltaire continued his nighttime escapades and romantic pursuits, and in 1751, he was sent back to Paris. Upon his return, Voltaire was repeatedly jailed for taunting the authorities, eventually being sentenced to temporary exile for ridiculing the regent. His defiance stemmed from his outspoken criticisms of the government, often in the form of satirical verses. After having written acerbic and critical verses directed at Louis XIV in 1717, Voltaire was imprisoned for 11 months in the Bastille. This was when he ditched his birth name and started using the alias Voltaire. Following his incarceration, Oedipus, a tragedy he had written, was restaged in Paris and was a resounding success. Voltaire earned a hefty sum for the performance, and it helped him to properly sort out his life. Later, following the success of Oedipus, and after enjoying a period of freedom, Voltaire, at the age of 32, headed back to the Bastille after a dispute with the nobleman Jean Chanot. He spent a few weeks there and was later exiled to England, where he stayed for 30 months. England was a crucial time in the French writer's life. He soon learnt the English language, studied the local culture, and became familiar with the country's literary, philosophical, and scientific classics. He was particularly drawn to the works of the philosopher John Locke and the physicist Isaac Newton, among the many authors he met. Voltaire was fascinated and thrilled by England, which he believed to be a freer and more prosperous country than France. During this period, he authored the essay English Letters, one of his most acclaimed works. He extolled the glorious free spirit and intellectual interdependence that prevailed in the country. Not only did he laud these positive aspects of England, but he also contrasted them with France, mentioning some delays and setbacks in his homeland. Despite his infatuation with England, the writer returned to Paris in 1729, and, without his permission, the English letters were published in his home country. The Paris Parliament raged against the work and ordered copies of the book to be publicly burned in the parliamentary courtyard. Voltaire, aware of the controversy he had caused, and before he could be thrown back into the Bastille, left Paris for Surrey, where he stayed at the chateau of the scholar Marquis de Châtelet, with whom he developed a love affair. His time in Surrey was fruitful, authoring significant books there, such as The Death of Caesar, Elements of the Philosophy of Newton, The Metaphysics of Newton, and others. Voltaire even had a laboratory in the castle to conduct scientific research and studies. The romance between Voltaire and the Marquis lasted around 15 years. In 1745, the couple moved to Paris, and after spending a few years in the city, the Marquis fell in love with the Marquise de Saint-Lambert, and the relationship between her and Voltaire finally ended. Despite the breakup, his stay in Paris was positive because, on April 15, 1746, the king appointed Voltaire as France's historiographer. Shortly after their relationship ended, two important works by Voltaire were published, Micromegas and Zadig, with the latter being one of his most important books. Albeit short, it contains considerable philosophical depth. The plot involves planet Earth being visited by a gigantic being from Sirius. Many philosophical reflections unfold during the extraterrestrial's long journey. It's a light read that reflects on several aspects of our reality. Zadig became one of Voltaire's most famous works. Zadig is the story's key character, with the entire narrative evolving around him. The protagonist is a wise Babylonian thinker who goes through many adventures sparked by how dynamic his destiny is. Apart from these two books, Voltaire kept writing and went on to publish many other works, and his pieces often contained biting criticism, laced with humor and irony. He attacked absolutism, the church, superstition, and the nobility. He also strongly opposed superstition, fanaticism, and intolerance, valuing freedom and exalting the power of reason. With his writings, Voltaire hoped to persuade people to think for themselves and break away from the constraints and traditions imposed upon them. The more he wrote, the more popular Voltaire became among his fellow countrymen. He gradually gained fame and received many letters from his readers. Frederick II of Prussia was one of the people who took a liking to the philosopher. In 1736, this great enthusiast of Voltaire invited the French genius to his court in Potsdam, Eastern Germany, but the writer rejected the invitation. Upon the Marquise's death, with whom he had a profound affection and admiration, Voltaire, overwhelmed with grief, agreed to a new invitation from Frederick II and left for Potsdam. After spending 3 years there, he ended up embroiled in disagreements that led him to being arrested again, this time in Frankfurt. He was released after spending some time in prison and wanted to return to Paris, but was shocked by the news that he had been exiled from his country. Voltaire found himself somewhat at a loss, wondering what options he had and where he could go. He finally bought a property called Les Délices and settled there for a while until 1758 he moved to Ferney, on the border between Switzerland and France. The Portuguese capital, Lisbon, was struck by a devastating earthquake in 1755, leaving many people dead. The catastrophe captured Voltaire's attention, particularly when he was informed that the French clergy claimed that the earthquake was to make people pay for their sins. He published a poem about it, and Rousseau, another great French thinker, himself one of Enlightenment's leading figures, gave a response, arguing in favor of the ecclesiastical interpretation. These events inspired Voltaire to write in only 3 days what is perhaps his most famous book, Candide. It tells us about the life of Candide, who, after having made the mistake of kissing his cousin, drifts from place to place, enduring the fickleness of his existence and meeting and relating to many different people. Naturally, the story has a deep philosophical backdrop. It has been translated into several languages and served as inspiration for countless other authors who followed Voltaire. His vast and important literary output includes the Philosophical Dictionary, considered to be history's first paperback book. The release of this portable edition was not only innovative, but also phenomenally successful, as people could easily carry it around with them. This way, knowledge and reading could be gained in an accessible and straightforward way. As with English letters, there was one occasion when a copy of the dictionary was burned. He authored several other important books, such as The Princes of Babylon, Treatise on Tolerance, The Man of 40 Crows, and many others. Voltaire fell ill at the age of 80. At 83, he decided to go to the French capital to attend the premiere of his tragedy, Irene, even though his doctor had warned him that the trip could damage his health. The philosopher was adamant and headed for Paris, where he was welcomed as a hero. After arriving, he hosted more than 300 people in his chambers, including the brilliant Benjamin Franklin, who brought his son to be graced by the genius French writer and thinker. Voltaire is said to have placed his hands on the boy's head and told him to devote himself to God and liberty. On February the 28th, 1778, now feeble and nearing his end, he wrote, "I die adoring God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies, and detesting superstition." Voltaire passed away on May the 30th, 1778. The philosopher was denied an ecclesiastical burial, and his body was taken by friends to Sayre, where he was interred. In 1791, however, the National Assembly forced Louis XVI to ask for Voltaire's remains to be sent to the Pantheon. The French genius's remains were escorted through the French capital, followed by a throng of people. His hearse bore the following inscription: "He gave the human mind a great impulse. He prepared us for freedom." Voltaire was one of the most brilliant men who ever lived. His writings are still relevant today. His timeless literary oeuvre is vast, totaling more than 70 works, all written in a wide variety of literary forms, such as philosophical essays, plays, novels, poetry, and letters. Voltaire urged his contemporaries to reflect more critically on distinct aspects of their daily lives through his insights and compelling writing, and his literary legacy lives on, prompting readers to ponder existence more deeply.